My mother brought the first hospital bill to my apartment, folded into a hard little square. Like if she pressed the paper tightly enough, it might stop meaning what it meant. She didn't say hello. She didn't sit down. She just stood there in my kitchen with rain on her coat sleeves and that envelope in her hand, looking like someone who had finally run out of easier people to disappoint. I remember the exact sound of the rain hitting the windows behind her. I remember my tea going cold beside my laptop. I remember the legal pad open on my table with work notes still half finished in my own handwriting. Because the timing of it was so perfect, it almost felt cruel. I work in healthcare finance. Not as a doctor. Not as a nurse. Not on the dramatic side of medicine where people clap and cry and call you a hero. I work in the part that starts after the emergency. The billing, the coding, the claims, the appeals, the patient balances, the payment plans, the part where fear stops being abstract and turns into paper. My mother did not know that when she raised me, she was raising someone who would someday be fluent in the exact system that would terrify her most. She definitely did not know that when she gave away my college fund, she held the envelope toward me and said, "I don't understand any of this." That was how she opened. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I know this is strange." Not "I didn't know who else to ask." Just, "I don't understand any of this." And in that moment, before I even unfolded the statement, I knew the whole evening was going to be built on the same foundation my childhood had been built on. She wanted this to be about confusion, not consequence, not history, not hierarchy, not the fact that she was sitting across from the daughter she once told to be understanding while she handed that daughter's future to her stepson. Confusion is easier than guilt. I looked down at the bill. Facility charges. Observation. Cardiology consult. Radiology. Medication. Insurance adjustment. Patient responsibility. The amount was high enough to scare her. Not high enough to tell me the truth by itself. I could already see one obvious possibility. A pending adjustment probably hadn't posted yet. There was another charge that looked like it had been timed wrong. And there were enough gaps in the documents she brought that I knew this was not the full picture. Before I said any of that, I asked the question that mattered most. "Where's Mason?" That was my stepbrother. "Mason." My mother's mouth tightened. "He's trying," she said. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because that sentence had been haunting my life for nearly 2 decades. He's trying. Mason was always trying. Trying to find himself. Trying to get stable. Trying to get serious. Trying to recover from a setback. Trying to make something happen. Trying to catch a break. I had heard some version of that sentence about him so often that it had stopped sounding like language and started sounding like weather. He's trying. A phrase soft enough to cover anything. Flexible enough to erase any failure. Emotional enough to make everyone else feel cruel for wanting actual results. I asked my mother, "Did you bring everything?" She looked down at the table. "This is what they sent?" "No." I said, "This is what you opened." That hurt her. I could see it on her face. And there was a time in my life when that expression alone would have changed everything about how I responded. There was a time when I would have immediately stepped around my own anger just to make sure she didn't feel cornered. But I wasn't that daughter anymore. Because daughters like that grow up. Or they break. And I had spent too many years breaking quietly. If this story resonates with you, like and subscribe. Some betrayals happen all at once. Others get spread out over years, until one day you realize the person who taught you to survive without help now needs help in exactly the language you had to learn because they failed you. My name is Elena Carter. I grew up in Indiana in a 2-story house with too much beige siding. A narrow porch my mother never used. And a kitchen that always looked more peaceful than the people inside it actually were. My father left when I was 10. Not in a dramatic way. No shattered dishes. No screaming. No scandal, people whispered about at church. He just drifted away the way some men do when they don't want to carry the guilt of leaving cleanly enough to be called villains. Another state. Another woman. Another job. Then fewer calls. Shorter calls. Missed weekends. Birthday cards with checks that arrived just often enough to make absence look technical instead of total. My mother, Sharon, learned to talk about him with this clipped, practical voice. Like if she never said the full emotional truth out loud, it would stay manageable. Then she remarried when I was 13. His name was Greg. Greg came with a son, Mason. Mason was 15 when they married. And he was the kind of boy adults mistake for full of potential because he was handsome, charming in short bursts, and emotionally chaotic enough to activate everyone's rescue instincts. He was never openly cruel to me, which almost made it worse. Open cruelty would have been simpler, cleaner, easier to point to. Mason didn't need cruelty. He had something more useful. He had adults who kept explaining him. If he failed a class, he was overwhelmed. If he quit a job, it wasn't the right fit. If he lied, he was ashamed. If he blew money, he lacked guidance. If he forgot something important, he was under pressure. If he disappointed people, the disappointment itself became evidence that he needed more patience. Everything about Mason was framed as unfinished redemption. He was always one rescue away from becoming himself. I, on the other hand, became the easy one. That was my mother's favorite phrase for me. You've always been my easy one. Adults say that like it's praise. Children know better. It means you need less. You complain less. You recover faster. You can absorb more without making the room expensive. I got good grades, not because I was trying to become extraordinary, because school made sense to me in a way family never did. Study, test, result. You put in effort, and something measurable came back. Home was different. Home was all tone and emotional negotiation and private hierarchy dressed up as compassion. At 16, I got an after-school job at a physical therapy office. Then I moved into more front desk billing support. Then insurance follow-up. Then basic claims assistance. It wasn't glamorous, but it changed me. I learned that adults panic most when they don't understand a system. I learned that paperwork has power. I learned that the difference between a crisis and a manageable problem is often just whether someone in the room knows how to read the forms. The office manager there, Rita Alvarez, once told me something that stayed in my body long after the sentence was over. People can survive bad news. She said, what they can't survive well is confusing news. That line would come back to me years later sitting across from my mother. But even then it felt true. By 17, I had a plan. Nota fantasy. A plan. Community college if needed. State school transfer if the scholarship math worked. Healthcare administration? Maybe. Or finance inside a hospital system. Or patient account management. Something stable. Something useful. Something that would let me build a life. No one could yank around because they were having feelings. And I had a college fund. Not huge, but real. My grandmother had started it when I was little. My mother had added to it when she could. A few tax refunds. A few birthday deposits. Some money my father sent that actually got directed somewhere useful for once. I knew exactly how much was in it because I had already built my future around it. Not lazily. Not entitled. Carefully. That fund wasn't luxury. It was structure. The shape of a beginning, which is exactly the kind of thing families like mine start eyeing the second someone more dramatic needs saving. The language shifted first. Our resources. What the family has. What really matters right now. What people do for each other. Nobody ever starts by saying, "We are planning to take what belongs to you." They start by changing the pronouns. Mason had already flamed out of one semester of community college by then. He'd quit a landscaping job because the boss was on his back. He'd wrecked a used truck. Greg helped him buy. He'd run up a credit card he absolutely should not have had. He'd started dating a girl in Bloomington and suddenly decided that life needed to begin immediately around whatever version of adulthood he found most emotionally flattering that month. Then came the private program. Sports rehab support. Therapy assistant track. Some adjacent to healthcare lane that sounded professional enough for the adults in the house to tell themselves this was his turning point. Mason said it was real this time. Greg said this could finally give him direction. My mother said maybe he had just never found the right path before. I remember standing at the sink one night while they talked behind me at the table. I remember the exact moment I realized no one was seriously debating whether this made sense. They were deciding how to pay for it. And a week later, my mother asked me to sit down in the kitchen. That sentence still has the power to tighten every muscle in my back. Can you sit for a minute? Every quiet family betrayal opens like that. Polita. Domestic. Reasonable. Soft enough that the person being harmed sounds dramatic if she names the truth too fast. I sat. Greg leaned against the counter. Mason hovered near the doorway in that guilty neutral stance people use when they want to benefit from a decision without being named as somebody who actively wanted it. My mother folded her hands and said, "You know Mason is trying to do something real with his life." Real. That word still stings. My plan was practical. My savings were responsible. My grades were disciplined. My future was measurable. His latest emotional reinvention was real. I said, "Okay." She said the program had a fall opening. She said the deposit was due soon. She said this could change everything for him. I felt the cold hit my arms before she even made the ask. I said, "What does that have to do with me?" Greg answered before she did. "We're looking at what resources the family has." There it was. Not your fund. Not grandma's money for you. Not the account meant for your degree. Resources. I said, "You mean my college fund?" My mother flinched the way adults do when a child uses the exact word they were hoping to avoid. That's not exactly how I'd put it. Which, honestly, I was almost the truest thing she said that night. Because she wasn't denying it. She was objecting to language that stripped the act of its moral makeup. I asked how much. She told me. And it was enough. Enough to change the beginning of my life. Enough to force a more expensive path over a longer stretch of time. Enough to turn a structured plan into survival math. Enough that I knew. Instantly. Nothing about my next 5 years would happen the way I had built it in my head. I said, "No." The room revealed itself immediately. My mother looked wounded. Greg looked offended. Mason looked almost insulted by the fact that I wasn't performing grace for the privilege of being used. My mother said, "Elena, please be reasonable." Reasonable. That word gets used a lot on the child whose loss has already been emotionally approved by everyone else in the room. Reasonable means, make this easier to witness. Do not use language too clean for the people causing it. Help us stay the good people in our own story. I said, "Why does he get my future because he keeps failing his own?" Mason stepped forward and said, "You're acting like I wanted this." I turned to him. "You did." He recoiled. Not because it was false, because I said it without emotional cushioning. Greg snapped, "That's enough." No phrase did more unpaid labor in my teenage years than "that's enough." Enough truth. Enough naming. Enough discomfort for the people with more power. Enough from the daughter whose official job was endurance. Then my mother looked at me and said the line that mattered more than the transfer itself. "You'll be okay." That was the real betrayal. Not the money moving. The hierarchy it revealed. You'll be okay. Capable daughters get robbed through praise first. You're strong. You're mature. You know how to work. You have options. You'll recover. Every one of those sentences means the same thing. We think your suffering will cost us less. I said. So, because I'm responsible, I lose my college fund? Greg answered, calm as if we were discussing weather. Because you're responsible. You have more options than he does. That line carved itself into me. My mother leaned forward. Family isn't about protecting your own little island. We help each other. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the sentence was obscene. Family in our house had never meant shared sacrifice. Family meant Mason got rescue. I got resilience. His chaos created urgency. My competence created availability. I said, apparently family means I'm the easiest person to take from. My mother stood up. Don't make this uglier than it has to be. As if ugliness begins when the injured person names it, not when the adults quietly decide her future is flexible because someone else is more emotionally expensive. The money moved anyway. Not in front of me. Not with a dramatic transfer. Just quietly. Administratively. The way family betrayals happen when the people committing them still want to think of themselves as practical instead of cruel. Within days. Enough of the account was gone that the life I had planned no longer existed in its original shape. My mother called it temporary help. Greg called it family support. Mason called it something he'd make right. Nobody called it what it was. Nobody said. We took from the child most likely to survive the loss, because survival made her the safest target. I started at community college. Worked almost full-time. Commuted. Lived at home longer than I wanted. Took classes in the morning. Worked afternoons and evenings. Studied tired. Ate cheap. Saved constantly. Learned how long resentment can stay functional when you don't have the luxury to collapse. People romanticize self-made women after the fact. They don't describe the middle accurately. The middle is exhaustion. The middle is carrying too many bags because every hour of your day has been pre-spent. The middle is checking your bank balance in grocery store aisles. The middle is watching the person who cost you years still get described as sensitive. Lost. Promising. Misunderstood. Mason lasted 9 months in the program. 9. Then the teachers were unfair. The schedule was impossible. The girlfriend transferred. The housing cost too much. The field wasn't what he thought. He needed time to regroup. He needed a new direction. By the time he dropped out, the money was gone, and the family story had already changed. The tragedy was no longer what had been taken from me. The tragedy, according to my mother and Greg, was how hard everyone had tried to help him. That is how some families survive their own conscience. They turn the harm into evidence of love. I didn't give them the scene they deserved. No screaming. No broken dishes. No dramatic exit speech they could later use to frame me as cold or difficult or ungrateful. I did something worse. I became less reachable. Slower replies. Less access. Fewer details. Fewer visits. More distance. Enough that outsiders would call it adulthood. Inside the family. It felt like betrayal. And in some ways, maybe it was. Just not the first one. I transferred later. Finished my degree while working inside a regional hospital system. Moved from patient account services to billing review. From billing review to assistance coordination. From there into appeals and compliance. From there into complex account oversight, where the numbers were larger. The paperwork messier. And the people more frightened. I became excellent at it. Because when you grow up in an emotionally dishonest house, administrative truth can feel almost sacred. A denial either has an appeal path or it doesn't. A line item either posts correctly or it doesn't. An assistance threshold either applies or it doesn't. A deadline either got missed or it didn't. There was cruelty in the system. Yes, but there was also sequence. And sequence is easier to survive than emotional chaos. By 28, I was training staff older than me. By 30, I bought my own condo. By 31, I was the person supervisors looped in when a patient balance situation was too layered, too emotionally volatile, or too administratively tangled for anyone else to explain cleanly. Nobody in my family understood what that meant. They still described my life in adjectives. Independent, steady, good with details, always so organized. They didn't understand that good with details had become power. My mother's calls stayed shallow. How are you? Are you sleeping enough? Have you heard from your father? Mason is trying something new. You've always been so resilient. I'm proud of you. You know, that last line hurt worst. Not because I thought it was fake, because she said it like pride could cover the debt. Then Greg got sick. First diabetes complications, then blood pressure issues, then a hospitalization, then follow-up testing, then medication changes, then more statements than anyone in the house knew how to read. The emotional theater of illness came first. The administrative reality followed. Fear. People understand paperwork. They don't. When Greg died 2 years later, the grief was real. So was the financial damage. And after he died, Mason moved back in for a while. Of course he did. Temporary is one of those family words that always means longer than the person paying deserves. Then my mother's health started slipping too. Chest pain, dizziness, medication changes, observation, imaging, cardiology, follow-up, more paper, more confusion, more silence around the kitchen table. By the time she brought that first bill to my apartment, she had already tried everyone else. Mason, my father, his sister, a church friend, a cousin. Only after every softer option failed did she come to me. That mattered. Because if you are the reliable child, you need to understand something brutal. You are rarely the first call because you are most loved. You become the last call because everybody still believes you can absorb one more emergency without breaking the whole story. When I told her to bring every document and then drove back with her to get the rest, her house looked exactly like the kind of house medical debt colonizes. Unopened mail under a fruit bowl, a portal password scribbled on an envelope, pharmacy bags on the counter, a pill organizer beside the sink, an outdated insurance card under a magnet, Mason's jacket over a chair, his shoes by the back door, evidence everywhere of a man old enough to help and still somehow optional. I spread everything out on the dining room table and started sorting. Facility, provider, farmacy, imaging, pending, collections risk, appeal window, assistance threshold. My mother kept saying, I thought insurance handled that. And they never explained this. And I didn't know this one was separate. I believed her. That was what made everything so exhausting. She wasn't lying. She was simply living the administrative version of the same truth that shaped our family. Confusion expands fastest in rooms where one person always assumes somebody else will eventually know what to do. By midnight, I had frozen one escalation, flagged 2 likely corrections, mapped out the missing documentation, and identified at least one balance that should not have posted yet. My mother looked across the table at me and said, Can you help me handle this? Handle this. That phrase should have offended me more than it did. Instead, it just made me tired. Because yes, of course, that had always been the structure. Mason generated instability. My mother generated guilt. And I became the system that converted both into something survivable. I said yes, but only with rules. Everything documented. Everything in writing. No loose paper piles. No misstatements. No Caleb by proxy questions through my mother. No emotional improvisation where deadlines were concerned. And no assumption that helping with one crisis meant reopening the old family architecture for everyone's convenience. The first month was all process. Calls, correction, provider statements, financial assistance forms, appeals, claim tracking, portal management, pharmacy savings review, payment plan negotiation. Mason floated around the edges of all of it, like a man who wanted moral credit for proximity to work. He had no intention of learning. He had opinions. Hospitals were greedy. Insurance was corrupt. Maybe the balance would go down if everyone just waited. Maybe Mom shouldn't stress herself out. Maybe none of it was as serious as it looked. That was Mason's adulthood in one rhythm, commentary where competence should have been. The confrontation came on a Sunday. Rain against the windows. Coffee turning cold. My binder open on the table. My mother sitting in a cardigan. Looking smaller than grief had any right to make her. I was explaining the difference between the posted statement balance and the actual likely patient responsibility once pending corrections and assistance review were applied. Mason wandered in halfway through. Poured coffee. Leaned against the counter. And listened just long enough to become irritated by the sound of a woman knowing exactly what she was doing. Then he said, "You really enjoy acting like the only person in the room who understands anything." My mother said his name softly. Not firmly enough. Not cleanly enough. Just enough to preserve the performance that she was trying to keep peace without changing the underlying structure that made peace impossible. I closed the binder. "What exactly do you do here?" I asked. He frowned. "What? What exactly do you do here?" He laughed once. "I live here." That wasn't the question. My mother said, "Elena, please." I ignored her. "What part of any of this have you handled?" I asked. "The calls, the statements, the portal, the assistance application, the pharmacy issue, the payment plan? What exactly are you contributing besides commentary?" His face flushed. "Not everything is paperwork." I almost smiled, because in the aftermath of illness, an astonishing amount of life is exactly paperwork. My mother said, "Both of you. Stop." And there it was. The oldest lie in the house. Both of you. As if commentary and labor were symmetrical. As if the person doing the work and the person mocking the work were equal disruptions. As if my refusal to keep carrying him silently was the same kind of problem as his refusal to carry anything at all. I turned to her. "No." She stared. I said it again. "Calmer. No. We're not doing that." The room changed. Rain. Refrigerator wum. Coffee mug. My mother's hands. Mason's silence. I said, "I am not the problem in this room. I am the only reason any of this is manageable." My mother looked shocked. Not because it wasn't true. Because I had finally said it in the original house where truth spent years being softened before it was allowed to exist. Mason scoffed. "You've been waiting years to say that." I looked at him. "No." I said, "I've been living years to earn the right." He went still. My mother started crying. And because I was no longer 18, I understood something clearly enough not to betray myself again. If I comforted her before I finished the truth, I would be teaching the room once more that her pain took priority the second the atmosphere got too hard. So I stayed still. She said, I know I failed you. That was the first clean sentence she had ever given me. Not, things were complicated. Not, we were doing the best we could. Not, you know what Mason was going through. Not, you always were stronger. Just, I know I failed you. I sat with that. Then I said, the money wasn't even the worst part. She looked up. And because half-truth is how families like mine keep living with themselves, I kept going. The worst part was that you taught me I was the child whose future could move. She covered her mouth. You taught me that if someone else had enough chaos, I was the one you could take from because I'd survive it. You didn't just move money. You ranked me, Mason muttered. That's dramatic. I turned to him. You are 35 years old. And your strongest adult skill is surviving other people's lowered expectations. Please don't talk to me about dramatic. Silence. My mother made a strange sound then. Half sob, half involuntary laugh. Because even she knew it was true. That was the climax. Not the bill. Not the amount. Not the hospital. The day the original lie of the family got spoken cleanly enough in the original house that nobody could put it back into prettier language. After that, things changed slowly, which is how real change actually works. I still helped my mother because I chose to, not because forgiveness arrived magically, not because helping erased what happened, because I knew the system, and I wasn't willing to watch her drown in it just to prove that I had the power not to save her. But I helped with boundaries. I would help her. I would not rescue Mason. I would not become permanent family infrastructure again. I would not let one medical crisis quietly rebuild the same old hierarchy inside my adult life. That mattered more than the account itself. Because if you grow up as the capable child, people never stop trying to move the line of what they think they are allowed to take from you. They only change the emergency. I finally stopped moving with the line. A few months later, my mother sold the house. Smaller condo. Less maintenance. Fewer stairs. Less room for old patterns to keep pretending to be love. Mason did not move with her. She asked whether I thought that made her cruel. I said, no. I think it means you're finally distinguishing help from indefinite shelter from consequence. She cried. But differently that time. Not to rearrange the room. To catch up with it. Mason called me once after the move. He said, you always wanted her to choose you. That old trick? As if not wanting to be sacrificed is the same thing as wanting someone else erased. I said, no. I wanted her not to sacrifice me. He had nothing after that, because there is no answer to a sentence that clean, unless you lie harder. My mother and I do better now. Not perfectly. Not softly in every way. Not in any way that makes the past prettier than it was. But more honestly, she asks before asking. She apologizes without explaining herself first more often than she used to. She no longer assumes my competence means automatic access to my time. My systems. Or my emotional labor. That matters. It doesn't erase. But it matters. A year after the first folded hospital bill, she came to my condo for dinner. Just her. I made salmon, potatoes, and the kind of salad she used to insist mothers should always serve when guests came over. Halfway through dinner, she asked, do you ever think about who you would have been if I hadn't done that? I knew what she meant. If she hadn't taken the fund, if she hadn't chosen Mason, if she hadn't taught me so early that my future could become flexible in the name of somebody else's need. Yes? I said. She looked up. Maybe hoping I would say something gentle. Something like maybe it all made me who I am. Something that would let her convert the damage into destiny. I didn't. I said, I still think I would have become capable. I just don't think I would have become this hard. She looked down at her plate. That was the truest answer I had. Because what people admire in women like me is often just scar tissue with excellent posture. I am calm in crisis. I can read systems. I don't freeze around paperwork. I know how to separate panic from process. I know how to stay emotionally vertical in rooms where other people collapse into confusion. But none of that arrived free. It came from learning too early that the people who call you strong may simply mean they plan to ask more of you than they would ever dare ask of the child they prefer protecting. If I could speak to the girl sitting in that kitchen at 17, hearing her mother explain why Mason's latest plan needed her money more than her future did, I would not tell her everything happens for a reason. I hate that sentence. It is usually spoken by people who did not pay the cost of the thing they are trying to make meaningful. I would tell her this: you are not selfish for wanting to keep what was meant for your life. You are not cold because you understand what is happening before the room is willing to admit it. You are not less lovable because the adults around you mistake your competence for consent. And one day, the exact kind of system that terrifies them will become the language you know better than anyone else in the room. Not because suffering made you special, because suffering made you attentive. Because being forced to grow around unfairness teaches some people how to read structures more clearly than the people who benefit from them. So yes, my mother gave my college fund to her stepson. A decade later, I was the one signing her medical bills. Not because revenge is poetic. Not because justice always arrives with applause. Not because the universe is unusually interested in symmetry. Because the child they treated like the spare adult eventually became the only actual adult in the room when consequence finally came due. And maybe that is the quietest kind of justice there is. Not making them suffer. Becoming the person they needed after they spent years proving they never understood what you were building. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And tell me where you're watching from and whether you think some families only recognize your value once the bill shows up in a language only you can read. There was one thing I did not understand when I was younger. I thought the hardest part of being the reliable child was surviving the original betrayal. It wasn't. The hardest part was learning that survival creates a second danger. Once the family sees that you can carry hard things without collapsing, they start treating your capacity like a shared asset, not as a trait they should respect, as a resource they are allowed to access. That is why boundaries mattered more to me than forgiveness ever did. It was not enough for my mother to say she regretted what she had done. It was not enough for her to cry. It was not enough for her to finally admit that taking my college fund had not been a complicated family decision, but a hierarchy made visible. If I was going to help her now, help had to stop, meaning surrender. That was the beginning of the second half of the story. Not the part where the past changed. The part where I finally stopped letting the past dictate the terms of my usefulness. The first real test came 3 weeks after that Sunday confrontation in her kitchen. I was at work when my phone buzzed with her name. I almost didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because she had been calling more often lately. And I was still trying to retrain both of us out of the old reflex, where every small inconvenience in her day automatically became my emotional assignment. But something in me knew this was different. When I answered, her voice came fast and thin. "The hospital called," she said. "They said something about the review not being complete and a balance moving somewhere else, and I don't know what that means." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not in dread. In concentration, because I knew immediately what had likely happened. The assistance review had probably stalled because one of the verification documents had been uploaded unclearly, and the account was moving toward a different internal status before the review team finished processing it. To me, that was not catastrophe. It was sequence. But to my mother, who had spent her whole life protected from sequence by the assumption that somebody else would eventually understand the thing that scared her, it felt like a trap door opening under her. "Did they say collections?" I asked. "No. They just said status and follow-up, and I didn't understand what she meant. Okay, I said. Don't call them back yet. Forward me the voicemail if they left one. I don't know how. Of course she didn't. That sentence might sound small to people who come from healthier families. It is not. Because in homes like mine, tiny helplessness becomes cumulative. Not malicious. Not staged. Just habitual enough that one person's confusion turns into another person's unpaid labor without anyone ever announcing the transfer. I said, "Fine. I'll come by after work." There was a pause. Then my mother said, more quietly, "Thank you." Not the old thank you. Not the kind parents say automatically, because politeness is part of their self-image. A thinner one? A more uncertain one. It should have satisfied me more than it did. But that is the thing about long-term family injustice. By the time gratitude finally arrives in a usable form, your body no longer trusts it as repair. When I got to her condo that evening, she already had the voicemail written down on a legal pad in uneven handwriting. The condo was smaller than the house had been. Cleaner too. Quieter. There was less room for performance. That mattered. Old houses hold old roles. Smaller spaces strip some of that away. I sat at her kitchen table, listened to the voicemail, opened her patient portal, and found the issue within 10 minutes. The income verification attachment had posted blank. A nothing problem. A very fixable problem. The kind of thing that becomes terrifying only when nobody in the room knows that terrifying and final are not the same category. I corrected the upload, sent the message, marked the timeline, and explained what would happen next. My mother sat across from me, watching with the kind of attention people reserve for magicians and surgeons. Not because the work was glamorous, because it was invisible to her until it wasn't. When I finished, she said, "You make this look easy." I looked at her. There was no accusation in her face this time. No defensive edge. No old suggestion that my competence was somehow cold or joyless or self-important. Just awe. And underneath it, something almost like grief. I said, "It isn't easy." She nodded slowly. "I know. That was new too. Because one of the most painful things about growing up like I did is that families often admire the result of your competence long after they have forgotten the cost of becoming competent in the first place. They see the calm, not the years that forged it. They see the control, not the fear that taught it to you. They see the steadiness, not the loss that made steadiness feel safer than need." I gathered the papers, put the folder back together, wrote down the next steps. Then she said, "Would you stay for dinner?" It was such an ordinary question that it startled me. For a second, I almost heard it the old way. The dangerous way. The way daughters hear invitation in families that have already proven they will use closeness to re-establish access. I asked, "Did you already make something?" She looked embarrassed. "I can heat soup." I almost laughed. Because that, somehow, I felt more honest than a lot of the grander emotional gestures she had attempted over the years. "No." I said, "I'll stay." The soup was tomato, canned, too salty. Served in bowls, she used to bring out only when guests came. Because for some reason, she had always believed matching dishes made life feel more coherent than it was. We sat at the little round table by her window. No Caleb. No Greg. No noise from the television. No emotional stagecraft. Just the two of us. And the strange, unfinished fact that I had become an adult with enough internal structure to sit across from the woman who had ranked me second and still decide, calmly, what kind of daughter I was willing to be now. That dinner did not heal anything. I need to be clear about that. People like tidy emotional arcs because they are comforting. They want the meal, the apology, the tears, the small laugh, the camera pullback that lets everyone believe reconciliation is just honesty with candles. Real life is slower, less cinematic, more administrative. That soup dinner mattered because it proved something narrower and, to me, more valuable. My mother could now be in a room with me without immediately trying to make my competence emotionally smaller to preserve her comfort. That sounds like a low bar. It is. Sometimes low bars are still major structural change. Over the next 2 months, my mother's billing situation improved. One pharmacy charge was reversed. 2 provider balances were reduced after corrections posted. The hospital assistance team approved a partial adjustment larger than I expected. The remaining balance became manageable enough to convert from panic into planning. It was not magic. It was process. And process, unlike family myth, works best when the person doing it refuses to confuse activity with transformation. I helped, but I watched. I watched what happened when the immediate fear lowered. I watched whether my mother's clarity lasted once the emotional temperature in the room dropped. I watched whether Caleb remained useless in the same old way, or whether the sight of me carrying everything in front of him would finally force some adult shame into his spine. It didn't. Of course it didn't. People like Caleb are not changed by seeing someone else do the work better. Usually they are only irritated by how obvious it makes their own emptiness. He made one half-hearted attempt to ask me how the patient portal worked. Not because he wanted to learn, because he wanted the appearance of engagement. I knew the difference immediately. He leaned in the kitchen doorway while I was printing out an updated statement for my mother and said, "So is this all basically just negotiating? Basically just..." I looked at him. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" He shrugged. "I mean, you call people. You argue. They lower things." That sentence told me everything. Not because it was insulting. Because it reduced labor, he had never once attempted into the kind of vague emotional improv men often assign to work done by competent women. As if sequence, knowledge, reading, deadlines, could, eligibility thresholds, and appeal logic were all just some feminine miracle of handling people. I said, "No, I understand the structure. So I know where it bends." He stared at me for half a second. Then he laughed, that little dry laugh people use when they have run out of respect, but still want to preserve superiority. "You always make everything sound so serious," I said. "Everything becomes serious when nobody else knows how to do it." He left the room after that. That was his great adult gift. Exit. That is what many families mistake for peace. Not resolution. Just the fact that the least useful person in the room no longer feels like being there. A week later, my mother called me again. This time not about a bill, about a checking account. Her debit card had been used for 2 charges she didn't recognize. Not huge ones. Delivery food and some online subscription. Nothing that would make a fraud department panic. Exactly the kind of thing that can keep repeating if nobody in the room knows how to look at patterns instead of events. I asked whether Caleb had access to the card. She said no, then hesitated, then said, "Well, not exactly," then said, "I mean, he knows where I keep it." I remember standing in my own kitchen, holding the phone and closing my eyes. Because there are moments where you realize a whole family's dysfunction is not a set of separate incidents. It is a design philosophy. Confusion. Access. Minimized boundaries. Delayed consequences. Then, surprise when the result looks like exploitation. I said, "Freeze the card," she said. "What if it's a mistake?" I said. "Then freezing it won't harm anything." She went quiet. Then she said, "Do you think it was him?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I doubted it. Because sometimes a parent is not asking for the truth. They are asking for one more minute before they have to say the truth themselves. Finally, I asked, "Has he done anything recently that makes this hard to rule out?" Silence. Then she exhaled. "I found one of his overdue notices in the recycling last week." There it was. The thing under the thing. In families like mine, money is rarely just money. It is proof of who is still being protected from adulthood, and who is still expected to absorb the fallout elegantly. I drove over that night. Not because I wanted to. Because I understood that if I didn't, she would do what she had done my whole life. Stall. Rationalize. Soften. And buy herself another week of confusion until the underlying reality had more room to spread. I froze the card, printed the recent activity, went through the bank app, changed the login, had her call the fraud line while I sat beside her. Then I asked, "Where's Caleb?" She said he was out. I asked, "Do you want me here when he gets back?" That question changed something in her face. Because for the first time, maybe ever, she understood that staying neutral was also a choice. "No," she said first. Then she looked at the table. Then she said, "Actually, yes." That was the beginning of the public reveal. Not public in the sense of a ballroom or dinner party. Public in the way truth becomes public the first time it is spoken in front of the person who has spent years relying on everyone else to keep naming him gently. He came home 40 minutes later, keys in the bowl by the door, shoes kicked off carelessly, the smell of cold air and gas station coffee following him in. He froze when he saw me sitting at the table with the bank printout in front of me, and my mother standing by the counter with her arms folded so tightly across herself, it looked like she was bracing against impact. "What's going on?" he asked. My mother said, "Sit down." He actually laughed. "What? Am I in trouble?" That line, that tone. There is a particular kind of male immaturity that only survives because everyone around it keeps translating real life back into adolescence. I said nothing. My mother said, "There are charges on my card." He shrugged. "So call the bank." I did. She said. He looked at me then. The whole thing clicked in his face. And there it was again. That tiny flash of resentment that always came over him when reality was no longer abstract enough to manipulate. He said, "Why is she here?" My mother's jaw tightened. "Because she knows how to handle things." That line would have satisfied me once. Now it just made me sad. Because it was true. And because it had taken her so long to say the truth without sanding it down into some nicer sentence. He looked between us. Then he said, "I borrowed it." Borrowed. Of course, that's what people like him call theft, when they assume repayment is a moral spell that changes the original act. My mother stared at him. "You borrowed my debit card?" "It was just for a few things. I was going to put it back." I almost laughed then. But not from humor. Because some family scripts are so old they recur like disease. I had heard those exact words before. Not about a debit card. About something else. Long ago. Different kitchen. Different girl. Same house philosophy. My mother looked at me. And I knew. In that second. She remembered too. Not because she said so. Because memory changed her face before language did. She turned back to him and asked, very quietly, "Were you ever going to tell me?" He rolled his eyes. "Mom. Come on. Come on." Another phrase built to make the harmed person feel theatrical for noticing the harm. Then my mother did something I had never seen her do with him. She did not soften. She did not rephrase for him. She did not move toward his discomfort, as though his discomfort were the central emergency in the room. She said, "No. Answer me." The silence after that was the first real adult silence I had ever seen exist between them. Not sulking. Not performance. Not delayed charm. Just exposure. He looked at me again. Like maybe I would save him from the directness. Like maybe the old pattern would kick in, and I would become the one blamed for making the room too sharp. I stayed still. That mattered too. Because part of what broke the old hierarchy was not just my mother speaking more cleanly. It was me refusing to volunteer as the softener when she finally did. He said, "I was going to fix it." My mother laughed. One short, strange sound. And I could see the exact moment she heard how small it sounded. How familiar. How old. How many years of her life had been eaten by sentences built on intention without structure. She said, "That is what you always say." He flushed. Then he turned the whole conversation exactly where men like him always turn it when they can feel moral ground slipping. To me. He said, "You just love this." I looked at him. "What? This?" Sitting there. Acting like you're better than everybody, because you turned your whole life into spreadsheets and systems. He said it with the same contempt he'd used when we were teenagers. The same blend of resentment and defensive superiority he always reached for when competence made him feel exposed. And because I was older now, and because I had spent years inside rooms where panic, billing, and human shame all coexisted without changing the truth of the numbers, I didn't rise to it emotionally. I just said, "No, I hate this. I hate that she had to learn who you are this late." He looked genuinely stunned. Because people like Caleb rarely expect to be described as a completed reality. They survive on, "Not yet." My mother sat down then. Slowly. Like her knees had stopped believing in her. She looked at the bank statement. Then at me. Then at him. And she said the sentence that finally cracked the whole thing open. "I did this to her. And I'm still doing it for you." Silence. The words stayed in the room like smoke. I did this to her. And I'm still doing it for you. That was the public reveal. Not the debit card. Not the charges. The recognition. The first time my mother connected the theft at my kitchen table all those years ago to the small daily permissions that had continued shaping her relationship with him ever since. He said, "That's not fair." She looked up, and for the first time in my life, she answered him without cushioning. "No," she said. "It isn't." That line nearly broke something in me. Not because it fixed the past, because it proved she had finally stopped confusing her guilt. His need. And fairness, he argued. Of course. People like him always do, once the family story stops bending around them. He said he'd been under pressure. He said he'd only meant to use the card temporarily. He said we were overreacting. He said I had always poisoned things between him and Mom. He said I had always resented how much attention he needed. He said I was making everything bigger than it was. Then he made the mistake that ended the old hierarchy permanently. He said, "She always needed to feel like the victim." And my mother stood up, not dramatically, not violently, just with an authority so unfamiliar it seemed to surprise all three of us. She said, "No." She learned early that I would make her pay for what you refused to become. He went quiet. I did too. Because sometimes the truth you waited years to hear still lands like impact when it finally arrives in exactly the words your body needed. He left that night. Not forever. Not with some cinematic speech. He packed enough clothes for a week. Slammed the door. And told my mother not to call him until she was ready to act normal again. Normal. There is no more revealing word in a dysfunctional family than normal. Normal means, go back to the arrangement that protects me. Go back to the hierarchy that hurts someone else more cleanly than it hurts me. Go back to the version of reality in which your clarity is the disruption. My mother cried after he left. But the crying felt different now. Not manipulative. Not centering. Not even especially useful. Just late. I stayed another hour. Made tea. Printed the fraud confirmation email. Wrote out the steps for replacing the card. Moved 2 important bills into a separate folder. Set a reminder on her calendar for the assistant's review follow-up. Then I stood to leave. She said, "I don't know how to apologize for all of it." I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "You can stop asking the wrong person to be more understanding." That was the most truthful answer I had. Because apology, in families like mine, is less about the beautiful sentence and more about whether the behavior underneath the sentence finally changes direction. The next months were quieter. Not easier. Quieter. Caleb tried to come back twice. Once through text. Once through a voicemail that sounded like a man auditioning for the role of accountable son, without having done any of the internal work required to play it believably. My mother did not let him move back in. That mattered. She sent him money once, a small amount, then told me voluntarily. That mattered too. Not because I wanted to monitor her, because secrecy had always been the lubricant of the old system. Transparency meant the system no longer had the same dark corners to reproduce itself in. My work kept intensifying. Healthcare finance is not a job that ever becomes emotionally light. It just becomes familiar enough that your body learns when to brace and when not to. There were days I sat in conference rooms explaining billing errors to families who looked like they were trying not to scream. There were days I helped parents apply for assistance while pretending not to notice the shame in the way they handed over pay stubs with shaking fingers. There were days I got home and stood in my own kitchen for 10 full minutes before taking my coat off because I had spent all day translating panic into process and didn't yet know how to stop. And through all of that, I kept thinking one strange thought. My mother used to think I was cold because I understood systems better than she did. Now the same ability was the thing keeping her from drowning. There is a kind of justice in that. Not triumphant. Not glamorous. But clean. Not the kind that makes you feel healed in one cinematic burst. The kind that rearranges what the truth of your life means. For years, I thought the lesson of my family was that being the reliable child makes you a target. That's true, but incomplete. The fuller lesson is harder and better. Being the reliable child makes you dangerous once you stop confusing reliability with obligation. That was my transformation. Not becoming competent. I had been competent since I was too young for it to be admirable. The transformation was learning that competence did not require surrender. That steadiness did not require access. That being able to carry weight did not mean I had to keep volunteering my spine every time the family structure started collapsing under the person they had spent years overprotecting. That understanding changed me more than any promotion ever did. About 6 months after Caleb left, my mother invited me to lunch. Public place. Small cafe. Neutral ground. That mattered too. Neutral ground is what families like mine use when they want to try honesty without the walls reminding everyone who they used to be. We ordered soup and sandwiches. She stirred her iced tea for too long before speaking. Then she said, "I used to think you were just harder than he was." I looked at her. She went on, "I thought you were more self-contained. More naturally capable. So every time something got hard, it felt logical to ask more from you and protect him more." She stopped, looked down, then said, "I told myself I was helping the weaker child. I didn't understand that I was training one child to collapse and the other to disappear." That sentence almost undid me, because that was it. That was the whole architecture in one line. Train one child to collapse. Train the other to disappear. I said nothing for a while. Then I asked, "Do you know what the worst part was?" She looked up and shook her head. It wasn't losing the money. Her eyes changed. I could see she had always believed the money was the center because money is finite. And finite things feel repayable. I said, the worst part was that I learned very early that your faith in my survival made me more expendable to you. She cried at the cafe, quietly, trying not to attract attention. The kind of crying older women do when they realize the version of themselves they spent years protecting has already failed under the weight of the truth. I did not comfort her immediately. That is something I'm proud of now. Not because cruelty is strength, because I had finally learned the difference between compassion and erasure. When I did speak again, I said, I'm not saying that to hurt you. She nodded. I know. I'm saying it because if you keep believing the money was the whole wound, you'll keep missing what actually changed between us. She nodded again, slower this time, and that was another kind of reconciliation. Not warmth, not total repair. Accurate naming. People think reconciliation means closeness. Sometimes it just means reality has finally stopped being edited. A few months later, Caleb called me directly. That was rare. He usually preferred indirect routes. Mothers, holidays, passive comments passed through other people. His voice on the phone sounded the same as always. Too casual, too familiar, trying to create a mood in which his lack of competence could once again pass for confidence. He said, I'm not calling to fight. That line almost always means the opposite. I said, then why are you calling? Long pause. Then he said, Mom says you think I'm a lost cause. I almost laughed, because the family disease was still there even now. Translate structure into tone. Translate reality into what someone thinks about you. Never sit long enough with the observable pattern itself. I said, no, I think you've spent years surviving on being unfinished. Silence. Then he said, you always talk like you're above everybody. There it was again. The old accusation. The last refuge of people who cannot argue with the content. So they attack the altitude. I said, no. I just stopped pretending confusion is the same thing as innocence. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he asked, very quietly, do you really think Mom loved me more? That question hit me harder than the rest. Because under all the drift and theft and entitlement, there it was at last. The real thing. Not logistics. Not tone. Not money. Love. I told the truth. I think she protected you more. I said, and I think she confused that with love for a long time. He breathed out hard. Then I said the second truth. And I think she expected me to survive what she'd never have asked you to survive. He asked, so what does that make me? I looked out my window at the parking lot below my condo and said, it makes you someone who benefited from something cruel whether or not you were strong enough to name it at the time. That was the closest thing to mercy I had for him. Not absolution. Not annihilation. Accuracy. We never became close. I don't think we ever will. Some relationships don't fail because no apology was offered. They fail because by the time the apology arrives, the architecture needed for trust has already been removed for safety. But that call mattered anyway. Because it was the first time Caleb spoke to me without using my clarity as a villain mask. He still wasn't whole. Still not especially responsible. Still not someone I would ever trust with money. Deadlines. Promises. Or any fragile thing at all. But for one brief moment, he was at least looking at the same truth I had lived inside all along. That counts for something. Not enough. Something. My mother's health stabilized after that. Not perfectly, but enough. The hospital account closed without disaster. The payment plan ended. The assistance review did what it needed to do. The panic that brought her to my kitchen became, finally, ordinary management instead of crisis. And once the immediate emergency was over, I waited to see what would happen, because that is the real test. Isn't it? Anyone can act reflective in disaster. Anyone can sound humble while they still need your fluency. The real question is what survives. After fear loosens its grip, would my mother slide back into old patterns once the bills were paid? Would my competence become invisible again the second it was no longer urgently needed? Would I once more become the daughter admired abstractly and taken concretely? The answer, to my surprise, was no, not completely. She changed in smaller ways than movies would find satisfying. But smaller ways are often the only real ones. She started asking before assuming. She started telling me things before they turned into emergencies. She stopped using me as a soft landing pad for Caleb's latest messes. She no longer spoke about my life as though its durability meant it belonged partly to the family by default. That was not repair. Repair is too grand a word. It was recognition with boundaries. And that, for some families, is almost miraculous. About a year after she first brought that hospital bill to my apartment, she came over for dinner. Just her. I cooked salmon, roasted potatoes, and a salad she actually ate, instead of pushing around for appearances. The kitchen was warm. No storm. No envelope. No urgency. Just two women sitting across from one another at a table that had once held a folded square of fear and now held actual plates. Halfway through dinner, she asked, "Do you ever think about who you would have been if I hadn't done it?" I knew exactly what she meant. If she hadn't taken the fund, if she hadn't chosen Caleb, if she hadn't taught me so early that my future could become flexible for someone else's crisis. Yes. I said. She looked at me carefully, maybe hoping for something soft, something redemptive, something that would let her tell herself the damage had become destiny, and destiny therefore made it meaningful. I didn't give her that. I said, I think I still would have become capable, but I don't think I would have become this hard. She looked down at her plate. That was the truest answer I had. Because what people admire in women like me is often just scar tissue with excellent posture. I am calm in crisis. I can read systems. I don't freeze around paperwork. I know how to separate panic from process. I know how to stay emotionally vertical in rooms where other people collapse into confusion. But none of that arrived free. It came from learning too early that the people who call you strong may simply mean they plan to ask more of you than they would ever ask of the child they prefer protecting. If I could speak to the girl sitting in that kitchen at 17, hearing her mother explain why Caleb needed the money more than her future did, I would not tell her everything happens for a reason. I hate that sentence. It is almost always spoken by someone who did not pay the cost of the thing they are trying to make meaningful. I would tell her this: you are not selfish for wanting to keep what was meant for your life. You are not cold because you understand what is happening before the room is willing to admit it. You are not less lovable because the adults around you mistake your competence for consent. And one day, the exact kind of system that terrifies them will become the language you know better than anyone else in the room. Not because suffering made you special, because suffering made you attentive, because being forced to grow around unfairness teaches some people how to read structure more clearly than the people who benefit from it. So yes, my mother gave my college fund to her stepson. A decade later, I was the one signing her medical bills. Not because revenge is poetic. Not because the universe keeps score in a satisfying way. Not because justice always arrives with applause. Because the child they treated like the spare adult eventually became the only actual adult in the room when consequence finally came due. And maybe that is the quietest kind of justice there is. Not making them suffer. Becoming the person they needed after they spent years proving they never understood what you were building. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And tell me where you're watching from. And tell me this too. Do you think some families only recognize your value once the bill arrives in a language only you can read?